Hey everybody, section 2.3 today. We're talking about functions, domain, and range. So I have a little bit of kind of vocabulary for you, some words that you've probably not heard before, and then a little bit of a different way of looking at graphs. So listen up here. We have a set of ordered pairs, and that's actually called a relation. So meaning like x values are related to each other with some y value, and your typical like relation that you're used to is seeing them in ordered pairs like this. That means that for the x value of 2, there happens to be a y value of 3. For the x value of 1, the corresponding y value is 5. So these numbers go together as an ordered pair. That's what a relation is. A new way of looking at it is like this. These are all of your x values, and they're going to a specific y value like this. So you can kind of think about this as your x values and this is your y values. And you can turn these into ordered pairs. That's what they mean. 10, 8, and -3, -5. And that's because each specific x value is going to a specific y value, and so you can turn it into an ordered pair like that. Just kind of a new way of writing ordered pairs that you need to be familiar with. Okay, and then we have a very specific kind of relation, which is called a function. And this is a really, really, really important vocabulary word that we're going to talk about for a really long time, pretty much the rest of the semester. So what this means is it's really important that you understand what a function actually is. There's every single x value goes to only one y value. Okay, so that means that no x values are repeated. So if you're asked if something is a function, you need to check the x values, which in this case would be these x values. You need to make sure that none of them are repeated. And what this means graphically is that the graph is going to pass the vertical line test. Hopefully you've heard of the vertical line test before, I'm not sure, but all that means is that you can draw a vertical line on your graph and make sure it only touches the graph one time. And then something that's a little bit confusing is that some of you will look at the y values, and if there are any y values repeated, then you'll think it's not a function, but it's actually okay if the y values are repeated. We'll talk about that graphically in class tomorrow, but it's the x values that you're checking. Okay, so examples of graphs that are not functions. I wanted to give you a couple of graphs that are not functions. And so what that means is if you have a standard like xy coordinate plane, what if you had like a, I don't know, a sideways parabola? Like this. Here's your graph. So here's what the vertical line test says. You can draw a vertical line on the graph anywhere, and if it touches the graph in more than one place, that makes it not a function. So no matter where you draw a vertical line on this graph, there's a lot of times where it will touch the graph more than one place. That means that it is not a function. This does not pass the vertical line test. Okay, let me give you another example of something that is not a function. Let's see, we could have a graph that looks like a backwards S or something like that. A weird looking graph, right? So again, here if I draw a vertical line right here or a bunch of different places, it touches the graph in multiple locations. This means not a function. Let me give you one more. Maybe you can think of a couple other shapes of graphs that are not functions, that do not pass the vertical line test. Any kind of a circle or an oval. Those do not pass the vertical line test either, because you can draw a vertical line on the graph and it will hit it more than one place. Okay, so let me give you a couple examples that are functions. I'll give you a couple examples over here just so you have an idea of what those look like. How about, let's see, how about a normal looking parabola? If you draw a vertical line on the graph anywhere, it will only touch the graph one time. So that makes that a function, definitely. Any kind of a linear graph, like a y = mx plus b situation, anywhere you draw a vertical line on this graph, it only touches the graph one time, so that one's good. Give you another one that we'll talk about in a little bit. How about an absolute value graph? Have you ever seen what an absolute value graph looks like? It's a perfect V. And if you draw a vertical line on that graph anywhere, it will only touch the graph one time. So that's good. These are all functions. And so what you're looking for in terms of the vertical line test is you want to see if any vertical line crosses the graph in more than one place. That means that it is not a function. Okay? A couple more vocabulary words, some really important words that we're going to spend several days talking about. The first one is the domain, and so this is the set of all x values. And the range is the set of all, what do you think? Y values. So it's kind of like looking at a graph and splitting up the x values and the y values. So it's almost like looking at these bubbles and turning all of your ordered pairs into just x values and just y values. So some people get confused with how do you remember the difference between domain and range and how do you just memorize it. So what I like to do is think about alphabetical order. D comes before R, and also X comes before Y when you're alphabetizing, so that helps me remember the domain is the X values and the range is the Y values. Just a little tip for you there. Okay, and what we're going to be doing is practicing writing domain and range, and looking at a graph and looking at ordered pairs and telling what's the domain and what's the range. And so when you're actually writing your domain and your range, if it's just a bunch of ordered pairs, then you're just using these curly brackets. And if it's an actual graph, you're going to use interval notation. Okay, so kind of a confusing topic here. We got a lot going on here, but let's just dive into this very first example. This is just a bunch of ordered pairs. And so the question is, are they functions? Is this group of ordered pairs a function? So there's kind of two methods that you could think about this. If you have memorized what we wrote above already, and you know that all we're looking for is all these x values to make sure that the x values are not repeated. And since we have the 2 used twice for 2 different y values, this makes it not a function because the 2 is repeated. Okay, so another way to think about this, because I know you guys have so much stuff crammed in your heads, you don't want to memorize things. I think you can probably remember the vertical line test, right? So what I like to do is I actually think about these ordered pairs in terms of a graph, and I'm just going to graph these really quick. So here's the 0.24. I also have the 0.26. The 0.58 is here, and 9.8 is somewhere like this, right? Okay, so here's what my graphs look like on my grid. And it doesn't really form some sort of a shape or anything, but remember, in order for something to be a function, it has to pass the vertical line test. And is there anywhere on this graph that I can draw a vertical line and touch more than one point? Absolutely. If I draw my vertical line, I missed my points there a little bit. That's okay. If I draw my vertical line right there, it touches the graph here and here. Again, this means not a not a function. So 2 different ways of thinking about it. If you're good at memorizing, then just look at the x values. If you need a more reason in terms of like why the x values can't repeat, then this is why. And again, remember how we said it's okay if the y values repeat? Here's why. Here's what it looks like when the y values repeat. That still passes the vertical line test. Okay, so the y values being repeated, it doesn't matter. It helps me to think about that in terms of graphing. Okay, let's go over to this one. So again, I'm going to check the x values really quick. -2, +2, -5. None of those are repeated, so yes, this is a function. Okay, if you want to look at it in terms of the other way we talked about it, if you want to graph those points really quick, -2, 5 is here. 2, 8 is somewhere up here, and -5, 8 is here. And notice how anytime I draw a vertical line on my graph, it's only going to hit one of those points. So yes, again, for the vertical line test, this is a function. You don't have to show both tests, but either way you want to think about it. This is a new vocabulary word, function, and this is what it means. It passes the vertical line test. The x values do not repeat. So that's all that you need to like think about in terms of what is the domain and range. Okay, so we have to answer those questions now. This first part, we skipped the domain and range part because I wanted to talk about like just how to determine, first of all, if it is a function, yes or no. Then we have to find the domain and the range. Okay, so what I like to do is list the D and then list the R instead of writing out domain and range. Okay, so again, in our little instructions up at the top, it said if it's just a bunch of ordered pairs, you're supposed to use curly Q brackets. And all I'm listing here is the X value. So the domain has to do with only the X value. So I have a 2, a 5, and a 9. You do not have to list the same number twice. So these are my values for my domain. It's only the X value. So it's separating the ordered pairs into X's and Y's, almost as if you were using like these weird bubble things down here. Okay, and then the range is the Y values. And again, my Y values here are 4, 6, and 8. And 8 again, you don't have to list the 8 twice. So 4, 6, and 8, those are the only Y values that pertain to this graph. So that's how you write domain and range, using those curly brackets when it's just ordered pairs. Okay, so moving on to the next one that we're going to do domain and range for again. I'm going to write domain, range. So again, just the domain has to do with the X values. So we have X values of -2, 2, and -5. So I'm going to list those, -2, 2, -5. You don't have to put them in order. You can put them in order if you want to. It doesn't matter. It's just a list of numbers. Okay, and then the range, we have 5, 8, and 8. So I'm just going to write 5 and 8. So it's like separating ordered pairs, which in your mind currently are together, separating them out, which is kind of weird. Okay, let's talk about number 3. And if you want to, in terms of like graphing this, you can, or you can just look at the X values and make sure none of them are repeated, and they are not. This is, yes, a function. If you need to sketch a graph of them and make sure it passes the vertical line test, then that is fine. Or you could just be looking at these X values and making sure that you don't have like the 6 going to the -5 and also to the 0. That would be a problem. But the fact that the Y values are repeated, so 6, -5, and 5, -5, remember that's okay. That will pass the vertical line test and we're fine there. So yes, this is a function. My domain is just all the values that are over here on my X and my Y part. The domain is the X part, so 6, 5, 2, -1. And the only numbers in the range bubble are -5, 0, and 3. Okay, and then going over to number 4. Again, if you need to think about these in terms of ordered pairs, this is -3 going to 1, -3 going to 5, and 12 going to -3. And the fact that this -3 goes to 2 different Y values, that's the X being repeated. If you would sketch a graph of this, this would not pass the vertical line test. So this is not a function. And yes, I like to say func for function, but I can still do my domain and my range. The domain is -3 to 12. And the range, not -3 to 12, excuse me, -3, 12. Those are the only 2 numbers for the X values, and the only 3 numbers for the Y values are 1, 5, and -3. Alright, you guys, so that, I believe, is all I wanted to get done in the video. What we're going to do in class tomorrow is actually talk about the graphs and determining, you could probably determine whether they're a function or not based upon like the pictures that we drew up here, all of these. You could probably determine which of the graphs, 5, 6, 7, 8, there's another 7 and 8, which ones are functions, but we will talk about the domain and range in particular tomorrow in class because it's a little bit of a confusing topic at the very beginning, but at least you got some of the basics down and you know what the vertical line test is, and that is the goal for this evening, okay? So thanks for watching. Have a good night. I'll see you tomorrow.